They nailed a sign above her door that read "Poisoner" and told the whole town of Coldwater Flats to stay away. But Vera Dunmore had poisoned no one. In the autumn of 1891, on the eastern edge of the Saskatchewan plains, where the wind came down hard off the open grass, and the cottonwoods along Bitter Creek turned yellow before their time, a woman was condemned without a trial, without a witness, without a single day in court. She was condemned by rumor, by grief turned sour, and by the ambition of one man who needed someone else to blame. Her name was Vera Dunmore. She was 31 years old, a midwife and herbalist who had delivered half the children in the valley and nursed the other half through their worst winters. She had lived alone since her mother passed, in a small frame house at the edge of town, with a kitchen garden and a root cellar full of dried plants hanging in neat bundles. Her hands were calloused and careful. She did not speak much. She did not need to. People came to her when medicines ran out, and the nearest doctor was 3 days east by wagon. Then Aldous Pembroke died. Aldous was 62 years old, a cattleman and speculator who had done well enough on other people's misfortune. He had bought up homestead debts during the dry years and pressed hard on those who couldn't pay. He was not loved, but he was feared, and in a place like Coldwater Flats, fear and respect wore the same coat. He died in October, 3 days after Vera had visited his estate to tend his wife, Lenora, who had been suffering with a chest complaint through most of that autumn. The timing was all Reginald Aldous Pembroke Jr. needed. Reginald was 34, the dead man's only son, and he had inherited his father's lands and his father's talent for using power quietly. Vera had no husband, no family left in the valley, no one to speak for her in rooms where decisions were made. In Coldwater Flats, that meant she had no shield. Reginald told the town that Vera had brought something in that root cellar bag of hers and given it to his father in the guise of medicine, he said. The old man had complained of his stomach after she left. He said he had seen her at the strongbox room, though he had seen no such thing. The sheriff, a man named August Crail, was one of 3 men whose mortgages Pembroke Sr. had held. He did not arrest Vera. He did not need to. Instead, he told the town she was not to be trusted, and the town believed him because it cost them nothing to believe him. By morning, her clients stopped coming. By the following week, no one would meet her eye at the dry goods store. By the month's end, Reginald had a sign nailed to a post in front of her house, painted in black letters, "Poisoner. Stay away." Vera stood on her porch and read it. Then she went inside and put the kettle on, because she did not know what else to do. She had not poisoned Aldous Pembroke. She had given Lenora a preparation of mullein and wild ginger for her lungs, left it on the kitchen table with instructions, and ridden home before dark. She had not entered any room but the parlor. She had not touched the strongbox, had not spoken to Aldous, except to nod as he passed in the hall. Aldous Pembroke had died of what men like him often died of, a heart that had worked too hard for too long at things that did not deserve its labor. But the town did not want that explanation. The town wanted something to hold. The hardest part was not the hunger, though that came too. It was the silence. Doors that had always opened now stayed shut. The widow Fry had once brought Vera blackcurrant preserves every September. Now she crossed the street. Young Tommy Bassett, whose breech birth Vera had managed alone in a January blizzard, played in the yard as she passed and did not look up, not because they hated her. Because Reginald Pembroke still held their notes, still controlled the grain credit, still sat on the land board. In Coldwater Flats, a person's conscience was a luxury they could not always afford. There was one exception. An old Métis woman named Suzette came every few days, moving quietly up the back path with bread or a jar of soup, always leaving before Vera could properly thank her. When Vera asked her why she wasn't afraid, Suzette said, "I've been afraid my whole life, my girl. It stopped interesting me." Then she left. That was November. By December, the sign was still up. 40 miles northwest of Coldwater Flats, past the ridge of spruce and the frozen cutbanks of the Notchaway River, there was a place called the Briar Creek property. It was a cattle operation of modest size, well kept, and known in the valley for producing sound stock. It belonged to a man named Calvin Holt. Calvin was 43 years old. He had come west from Ontario 18 years earlier, with a young wife named Marin, and enough savings to stake a claim. They had built the place together, board by board, season by season. They had 2 children who did not survive their first winters. They did not speak of it often, but it lived in the walls of the house, in the way Marin sometimes stood too long at the window, looking at nothing. Then Marin herself went in the spring of 1889, of a fever that came on fast and did not relent. Calvin had ridden 3 days to fetch a doctor from Fort Assiniboia, and come back to find the house already quiet. He buried her on the south slope, where the poplars caught the afternoon light, and after that he closed the spare rooms and did not open them. He had heard of Vera Dunmore the way anyone out on the range heard things, in pieces, from a distance, with no clear sense of what to believe. He heard she was a healer. Then he heard she had poisoned a man. He had no opinion. He was not in the habit of forming opinions about people he had never met. He came to Coldwater Flats in the second week of December to pick up a supply order and to see about a part for his harness that had cracked in the cold. He came alone. He always came alone. He was riding out along the south road when he saw the sign. It was nailed high on the post, black letters, no softening to it, and beneath the sign, in the yard of a frame house with a snowbound kitchen garden, a woman was chopping wood. Slowly. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, as if each swing were costing her something she did not have left to spend. She stopped when she heard his horse and looked up. She did not beg him to stop. She did not call out. She looked at him the way a person looks at a passing wagon when they have been waiting too long in the cold, with recognition that help might not come and the quiet decision to go on anyway. Calvin pulled up. He looked at the sign. He looked at her. "You Vera Dunmore?" he asked. "I am," she said. He read the sign again. "You poisoned that man?" She held his gaze. "No." He sat with that for a moment. The horse shifted under him. The wind moved across the yard. Calvin was not a man who made decisions quickly, but he was a man who made them honestly. "Your wood's cut green," he said. "Won't burn clean through the night." Vera looked at the pile. "I know. It was what was left." He swung down from the saddle. He did not say anything else. He tied the horse to the post, the one with the sign on it, and picked up the axe she'd set down, and spent the better part of an hour splitting the seasoned rounds he'd noticed, stacked against the far fence, left there by someone who'd stopped coming. When he was finished, he stacked them near the door where she could reach them easily. He put his coat back on. He looked at her. "I'll be back through in a week," he said. "If you need anything brought from town, write it down." Vera stared at him. "You'll lose trade with the Pembrokes," she said. "I expect so," Calvin said. "They hold notes in this valley. They don't hold mine." He rode out before she could answer. The town noticed. In a place like Coldwater Flats, a man tying his horse to the post with the poisoner sign was as loud as a gunshot. Augustus Crail came to Calvin's supply house the next morning and told him, in a tone that meant to sound like concern, that associating with Vera Dunmore was not a thing a sensible man did. Calvin listened until Crail was finished. Then he paid for his harness part and left. Reginald Pembroke sent a rider to the Briar Creek property 3 days later, with a message suggesting that Calvin's grazing lease on the north section, which Pembroke now controlled through his father's estate, might be reviewed. Calvin read the message. He set it on the kitchen table and made himself tea. That night he sat in the chair by the window where Marin used to read, in the house that still carried her quietly in its beams and floorboards, and he thought about what kind of man he intended to be in whatever years he had left. He rode back to Coldwater Flats the following week. Vera was thinner than he'd expected. She opened the door before he knocked, as if she had heard the horse while it was still far out. She stood in the doorway with the kind of composure that comes not from confidence, but from having already expected the worst and survived it. I found something, she said, before he could speak. She had been going through Lenora Pembroke's receipts. The woman had sent them with her original message, asking for the remedy, wanting Vera to know the cost of the ingredients so she could be reimbursed. Vera had kept them, and tucked inside the folded paper was a note in Aldous Pembroke's handwriting. A note to his solicitor in Regina, dated 2 days before he died, asking for a review of the estate accounts. Aldous had believed his own son was misusing funds. Vera laid the note on the table. Calvin read it twice. Does anyone else know about this? Lenora knows he wrote it, Vera said. She was in the room when he did, but she's afraid of Reginald. He controls everything she has now. Who else might have seen something? Calvin asked. Vera thought carefully. There was Hector, the estate handyman who had told her once, in passing, that he'd seen Reginald in his father's study late at night, more than once in the weeks before the death. There was June Pratt, who did laundry for the Pembroke household and had washed a coat with a stained inner pocket, and said nothing about it because she needed the work. There was a boy named Silas, the stable hand, who had overheard Reginald and a land agent talking in the barn about titles that were not yet his to discuss. None of them had spoken. All of them had reason. Calvin listened to all of it without interrupting. When Vera finished, he looked at the note on the table and then at her. You shouldn't have to prove your innocence, he said, but you're going to have to anyway. Vera nodded. I know that. You want me to go with you. I want to go myself, she said. I want you to come with me. He understood the difference. He said, all right. The next morning, Reginald Pembroke sent 2 riders to the Briar Creek property. Calvin met them in the yard with a calm that had nothing performative in it, the calm of a man who had already decided what he was, and was no longer available to be frightened out of it. He told them to take their message back. He stood in the yard until the riders were out of sight. Then he saddled his horse. They went first to Lenora Pembroke, who received them in the parlor of the estate's main house, with the careful stillness of a woman who had learned to be invisible in her own home. She was 60 years old, with eyes that held more than she permitted herself to say. She looked at the note when Vera unfolded it, and her hands trembled. He was afraid, Lenora said quietly, not of dying, of what Reginald might do after. Vera kept her voice soft. Did he say so? He said the accounts were wrong. He said money had moved that shouldn't have moved. Lenora looked at her lap. I told him he was imagining things. I was afraid of what it would mean if he wasn't. Will you speak to that now? Calvin asked. Lenora was quiet for a long time. Outside, the winter light came flat and pale through the parlor windows. He was not a gentleman, she finally said, but he was honest in his ledgers. He would not have written to a solicitor without reason. She looked up. Yes, I'll speak. Hector was next. They found him in his workshop behind the carriage house, methodical and careful over a broken wheel rim. He was a man in his late 50s, built like someone who had spent 40 years doing what needed doing without expecting to be thanked. When Vera told him why she had come, he set down his tools. I saw Reginald at the study door 3 nights running, he said, after midnight. Each time he came out carrying papers. He picked up a rag and wiped his hands. I know what I saw. Would you say that in front of other people? Calvin asked. Hector looked at him steadily. I kept quiet because I needed this position. My wife is sick. I have children. He folded the rag. But I've been ashamed of myself since October. Yes, I'll say it. June Pratt met them at her door with a wariness she did not bother to hide. She was a practical woman, lean from hard work, with the particular dignity of someone who has never had enough and never made anyone else feel worse about it. When Vera showed her the note, June read it carefully, then handed it back. The coat pocket was stained with ink, she said, and there were papers inside it, folded tight. I put them aside without looking because they weren't mine to look at. She paused. I put them under the lining when I returned the coat. I thought I was protecting myself. I think I was protecting him. She meant Reginald. She said it, without flinching. Will you tell people that? Vera asked. June's jaw tightened. I sold my silence for a month's laundry work, she said. I won't sell it again. She reached behind her door and took down her coat. I'll come with you now if you're going. They found young Silas at the livery stable, where he'd taken work after Reginald dismissed him in November. He was barely 18, and the fear in him was visible, the kind that comes from a threat delivered quietly by someone with the power to follow through on it. He backed against the stall when he saw them. Vera spoke first. No one will make you do anything, she said, but I need you to know that you are not the only one carrying this. Silas swallowed hard, his teeth were shaking. He told me if I said anything, I'd be run out of the district, that no one would hire me. He was probably right about that then, Calvin said evenly. Things have shifted. Silas looked at him, at Vera, at June, who stood in the doorway with her coat on and her chin level. I heard him tell the land agent that the Beaumont Quarter section would be in his name inside the month, Silas said. His father was still alive. The agent said that was irregular. Reginald said his father's opinions would shortly stop mattering. He exhaled shakily. I've been sick about it since. Vera put a hand briefly on his arm. Then come and say it where it can be heard. Market day in Coldwater Flats happened on Fridays, when wagons came in from the surrounding homesteads and people gathered at the meeting hall and the main street to conduct business, settle accounts, and do the slow social work of keeping a community knit together through a hard winter. Reginald Pembroke was always there. He liked to be seen. He believed still that being seen was the same as being respected. He was standing near the entrance of the meeting hall, speaking to Sheriff Crail when Vera Dunmore walked into the square. The noise did not stop exactly. It shifted. People turned. Several looked away immediately. Several could not. Vera walked to the steps of the meeting hall and turned to face the street. She was wearing her good coat, the wool one her mother had made. Her hands were still. Her voice, when she spoke, carried easily in the cold air. My name is Vera Dunmore, she said. I have lived in this valley for 11 years. I have helped to bring 63 of your children into the world. I have sat with your sick and your dying and asked nothing back but common decency. I did not kill Aldous Pembroke, and I have come today to show you why. Reginald's face tightened. He moved toward the steps. This is not the place for your lies. Your father thought so, Vera said. She unfolded the note and held it up. This is Aldous Pembroke's handwriting, dated 2 days before he died. He wrote to his solicitor in Regina because he believed money had been moved from his estate accounts without permission. He believed his own son was the one moving it. A hush settled over the square. Reginald's voice went sharp. That's a forgery. Lenora Pembroke was in the room when he wrote it, Vera said. And Lenora Pembroke, who had come in quietly from the east end of the street, stepped forward. Her presence in that square, in front of that crowd, cost her something that no one watching would ever fully understand. She was a woman who had spent 40 years making herself small enough to survive. But she stopped beside Vera and said, My husband wrote that letter. I watched him write it. He was not ill when he wrote it. He was frightened. Reginald took a step toward her. Calvin stepped between them. He did not speak. He did not need to. I was at the Pembroke estate on the nights in question, Hector said from the edge of the crowd. He walked forward, hat in his hands. 3 nights running, after midnight, I saw Reginald in his father's study. Each time he came out carrying papers. He looked at Reginald directly. I know what I saw. June Pratt came forward next. I washed his coat the morning after, she said. It was ink-stained at the pocket, and there were papers inside it I should have looked at, and didn't. He paid me extra not to ask questions. I shouldn't have let him. Her voice was flat and honest, but I'm asking them now. Then Silas, young and pale and still trembling, walked out of the crowd and stood on the open ground. He told the land agent his father's opinions would shortly stop mattering, Silas said. I heard it, in the barn, 6 days before Aldous Pembroke died. He swallowed. I should have said so sooner. I was scared. No one in the square moved. Every piece of it lay there in the cold air. visible to anyone willing to look. The note, the midnight vigils, the stained coat, the gold spent before it was inherited, the careless words in a barn. Reginald looked at the crowd. He had built his authority on the certainty that people would not speak, that they valued their mortgages more than their consciences. That calculation had always worked before. It did not work now. "You have no proof of anything," he said. But his voice had changed. It was thinner than it had been. "The solicitor in Regina has the original inquiry," Vera said quietly. "He received it the day before Aldous died. He's been waiting to hear whether anyone in this valley intended to follow up on it." Sheriff Crail had not moved from the doorway of the meeting hall. He was looking at the ground. He was the sort of man who had told himself for years that following orders was not the same as wrongdoing. He was beginning to understand that the difference was harder to maintain in public than in private. Slowly, without drama, he reached up and removed the deputy's star from his own lapel, because he had no deputy to pass the reckoning to, and set it on the railing of the meeting hall steps. "Reginald Pembroke," he said, "I am placing you under arrest for fraudulent manipulation of estate accounts and for making false allegations resulting in public harm." He paused. "I should have done this in October. I am doing it now." What followed was not triumphant. It was exhausted and a little stunned, the way things feel when a lie that has been load-bearing for a long time finally comes apart. People stood in the cold of the market square and looked at each other, and said things quietly that they had not said aloud in months. A farmer who had been paying a false debt reckoning said so to his neighbor. A woman who had watched Vera's sign go up and done nothing about it came and stood near her, without speaking, which was its own kind of apology. The sign came down that afternoon. It was Hector who pulled it from the post with a claw hammer, and he did it without ceremony, and no one cheered. They were all too tired for cheering. The wood was thrown into the smithy fire. Coldwater Flats did not make a symbol of it. That was not the way of the place. But something changed that was real and lasting. In the weeks that followed, the solicitor from Regina came west and opened the estate accounts. The irregularities were substantial. Several homesteaders found that debts they had been told were outstanding had, in fact, been paid and recorded falsely. Lenora Pembroke, with the help of an honest land agent from the next district, began the process of ensuring that her own portion of the estate was properly accounted for. She came to Vera's kitchen one afternoon with a tin of ginger biscuits and stayed for 2 hours, saying more in that visit than she had probably said to anyone in years. June Pratt was asked by 3 families if she would take their laundry accounts. She took 2 of them and turned down the third politely, because she had enough now. Hector kept his position at the estate under new management and no longer had reason to keep secrets. Silas found steady work at a ranch north of town and wrote Vera a short letter in the spring that she kept in the dresser drawer. Calvin stayed in Coldwater Flats longer than he meant to. He told himself it was the supply run, that the harness needed another adjustment, that the trail north was poor in the ice melt. These things were true. They were not the reason. He had started eating supper at Vera's table on the evenings he stayed in town, because she had offered once and he had accepted, and after that it seemed easier to keep doing it than to explain why he had stopped. They talked about practical things at first: livestock, weather, the price of seed. Then they talked about other things. He told her about Ontario, about the drive west, about building the Briar Creek house in the first cold autumn, with Marin passing boards up to him through the unfinished walls. He had not said Marin's name easily in 3 years. He noticed that he could say it now, without the words sticking in his throat. Vera told him about her mother, about learning the plants, about the first birth she had attended alone, terrified at 19 years old, in a farmhouse outside Moose Jaw in the middle of the night, about what it felt like to do something that mattered with your hands. One evening, late in February, with the lamp burning low and snow coming sideways off the prairie, Calvin looked across the kitchen table and said, "You never asked me what made me stop that day." Vera was quiet for a moment. You were tired of looking away, she said. He considered that. Something like it, he said. Marin would not have let me ride past. Vera smiled, not with pity but with recognition. Then she did stop you, Vera said. Calvin looked at the window for a long time. Outside, the snow moved across the dark. Yes, he said. I suppose she did. The formal clearing of Vera's name came in the spring, read out by August Crail's successor, a deputy named Aldred, in the meeting hall with a small crowd gathered and the windows propped open to let in the first warm air. Vera Dunmore was falsely accused. Aldred read from the county record, and is hereby cleared of all allegations. Her standing in this community is fully restored. He was a young man and he read it carefully, as if the words deserved the weight he gave them. Vera stood in the back of the hall and heard it and did not cry. Not then, she had cried already. In the way you cry when you are alone and the thing is finally over, and there is no one to see it. What she felt in the meeting hall was quieter and harder to name. Not relief exactly, more like the way ground feels when the frost finally goes out of it, and it is simply earth again, patient and available for what comes next. She and Calvin were married in June, under the poplars on the south slope of Briar Creek, where Marin was buried. It was Vera who had suggested that place. Calvin had not been sure, at first, if it was the right thing. Vera had said, she was here first, she should be part of it. And something in him had settled that had been unsettled for years. Suzette came, and Lenora, and June, and Hector, and Silas, and a dozen others from the valley who had been through the winter with them in one way or another. It was a plain ceremony, the way things in that country tended to be. Someone brought dried flower stems because the wild roses were not yet fully out. Someone else brought a fiddle. The children from 2 homesteads ran between the poplars and paid no attention to the service. Vera wore a new dress, blue wool, made by June and Lenora together, each of them sewing a portion of it over the course of 3 weeks in Lenora's parlor. They had not told Vera the color until she put it on. Blue, like the letter in the note. Blue, like the cold that had tried to break her and had not. Blue, like the sky on the morning she had walked into the square in Coldwater Flats and said her own name out loud in front of the people who had taken it from her. After the service, Calvin stood with her under the poplars in the late afternoon light and looked out at the grass running west toward the big sky. The Briar Creek house was visible from the slope, its chimney going, the barn sitting solid in the afternoon. I told myself I stopped for the wood, he said. Vera looked at him. I was lying, he said. She took his hand. I know. He looked toward the south slope, toward the small marked stone where Marin lay, and the prairie light ran long and level across everything. I closed this house up, he said. After she went, I thought that was the right way to honor her. He paused. I think she would have said something else. Vera held his hand and did not rush him. I think she would have said a house is meant to be open, he said. That evening, when the guests had gone, and the fiddle was silent and the summer dark was coming in, off the grass, they lit the lamp in the kitchen window of Briar Creek and left it burning. Not for any visitor in particular, just burning. The way things burn when there is warmth enough to spare, and for the first time in a long time, in that house on the Saskatchewan plain, the light reached all the way to the walls.